the propagation of action potentials, which cause the well-organized pattern in the contraction of the heart. That's our goal, is to understand the heartbeat at the cellular, molecular, and system organ level. And then, hopefully by the end of class today, we'll put that together into understanding the electrocardiogram, which you will study in lab today. So half of the lab today will be on you measuring electrocardiographic recordings of yourselves or your friends in lab. It won't be exactly the same as what you get in the hospital, but it'll be more educational, actually. And the other half, while one half of the lab is working on the electrocardiogram, the other half will be working on the frog heart to be seeing hopefully, the changes in the heart rate due to some of the sympathetic and parasympathetic influences that we'll be talking about today. I just found out, when I went down to get the battery, that I ordered 12 frogs, which was enough for the whole lab, but I only got 8. I don't know why. So we're going to, instead of having groups of 2 and 3 students per frog, we're going to have groups of 3 or 4 students per frog in order to spread it out. So 4 is a little bit, crouching around a frog with 4 students isn't great, but we'll just have to make do. We only have 8. Apologize for that. It's not my fault, but you'll get a lot out of it. Okay, so let's do the first clicker. Let's start over here.
No.
Oh, no.
What are the ion channel mechanisms? Well, let's reach consensus. Would you rather just all show me your answers?
That's quick process.
Show me your answer to this question. What are the ion channel mechanisms for the slow, ultra-slow pacemaking depolarization in the SA note? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of some perfectly correct answers and some not correct answers. So let's walk through this. And the way to see this is if you look at the slide 7, which is in the lower right-hand corner. I'm not going to show it because the next couple of slides are another clicker. The slide in the lower right-hand corner shows the ultra-slow depolarization, and it shows sodium entry through IH channels, closing of voltage-gated potassium channels, and calcium entry through a few open calcium channels. So those are the mechanisms for the ultra-slow depolarization. Many of you got some of the answers right. Only a few of you got all of the answers right. These are the 3 main mechanisms. Sodium permeable channels that are opened by hyperpolarization, that's IH, sodium influx, depolarization. Voltage-gated potassium channels close, reducing potassium efflux. Less potassium efflux is what allows the influx of sodium to have more of an effect. Some voltage-gated calcium channels open, calcium influx, more depolarization. So all 3 of those things contribute to that ultra-slow depolarization. Voltage-gated sodium channels don't play a role. Okay, so now let's do the next one. What is the difference between calcium channels that are opened during the pacemaker depolarization and the ones that are open during the upstroke in pacemaker cells? Show me your answers. And it was really helpful for me to see everybody's answers. So you worked on it, you came up with an answer, it might not be right, it doesn't cost you anything to show me a wrong answer. In fact, it could be beneficial because I could try to clear it up. Best answer here is A. There's no real difference. It's just that in the, so let me go now to the slide that we're looking at. During the slow pacemaker, the ultra slow pacemaking potential, we're talking about this part right here. So this is the pacemaking potential, and this is the upstroke of the actual action potential. And you can see during here, calcium entry, and here you see calcium entry. It's the same channels. It's just that here we haven't depolarized enough to open very many of them. And here we're depolarized more, so more and more of them open, more and more calcium influx. It's a more rapid depolarization. It's still very slow compared to the nerve depolarization and the ventricular and atrial muscle depolarization that depend on voltage-gated sodium channels. I think I just gave you a clue for one of the other clickers. Okay, but the channels here and the channels here are pretty much the same. So let me go back to the answer. Some of you said B. None of these calcium channels are opened by hyperpolarization. So that was the clue that D was wrong. And C, well, it's not a trick question. It was a very straightforward question. So it's your job to now take this knowledge and understand this pattern of voltage. Remember, depolarization is up. Voltage as a function of time in pacemaker cells. Questions? Because many of you didn't get them all right, so that means there's room for a discussion here. That's what this clicker thing is all about. Well, I'm happy to answer questions in the lab this afternoon or at any time. Michael?
How does voltage-gated potassium channels closing exist in depolarization?
So, voltage-gated potassium channels, when they're open, potassium flows out, and that efflux of potassium tends to make the inside of the cell more negative. So more potassium channel activity, more potassium efflux would tend to bring this down. And it would tend to hold it down if there was a lot of potassium channel activity. Potassium channels bring it down and hold it down. But if they close, then they can't hold it down, and so the other things then can let it go up. Okay, so now we're moving along. We've covered this. Now we're going to talk about the spread, okay? Let's see, what is this question? Why do pacemaker cells, so that's SA node, slowly depolarize during the pacemaker potential, and contractile cells in the atria and ventricles do not? Basically, it's getting back to, we have pacemaker cells that fire an action potential that looks like this, and then we have that spread, but those cells stay negative until they get the stimulus from their neighbors. Okay, so let's show me your answers. Okay, so many of you are showing me a partially correct answer. I'm going to give you a hint. There are two correct answers. Okay, that tricked you up. That tricked you up. A and B are the best answers here. So let's go through it, because many of you came up with B. So B was the answer that was obvious. Pacemaker cells have more IH channels. That is a true statement. Cardiac myocytes, the contractile cells don't. But pacemaker cells also have fewer K channels that hold the membrane negative. Ventricular myocytes, if we look at the action potential, which is slide 17, the upper left-hand corner of figure 3, the action potential starts at a very negative resting membrane potential. It's extremely negative because they have a lot of resting potassium channels. So pacemaker cells have fewer resting K channels than contractile cells. D, so you came up with D when I asked you to come up with a second answer, and they don't. Nope, both cells have plenty of calcium channels. There's no systematic difference there. Questions? Okay. Why is the upstroke depolarization in pacemaker cells slow compared to the upstroke of the depolarization of contractile cells in the atria and the ventricles? Show me your answers. again, I'm going to give you a hint, but hopefully the hint will be helpful this time. There are 2 correct answers. Good, that one worked. Show me your answers. Let's see. The upstroke in pacemaker cells is caused by calcium channels, and the upstroke in ventricular myocytes or atrial myocytes, the contractile cells, is caused by voltage-gated sodium channels. And voltage-gated sodium channels are fast compared to voltage-gated calcium channels. Those are the 2 molecular mechanisms that explain this difference in the upstroke. Okay? Yes, question?
Is that a true relationship between all cellular calcium channels?
I'm always careful to say about all, but as far as I know, all voltage-gated sodium channels are faster than all voltage-gated sodium channels are faster than all known voltage-gated calcium channels. And by faster, I mean they activate faster, they're intrinsic kinetics. They activate faster and they inactivate faster. I'm pretty sure that's a 99% true statement. Yes.
So then what you just said, what's the difference between C and D?
C and D.
Yeah.
That's a true statement, but it doesn't explain the upstroke.
Okay. I got it.
D is a true statement, but it doesn't answer the question. So don't let true statements that aren't germane throw you off. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you explain how C makes it, like activating faster makes it slower?
No, activating faster, sodium channels activate faster, so the depolarization is faster in ventricular myocytes. So be careful about whether, in A, I'm talking about pacemaker and then contractile. In C, I'm talking about sodium and then calcium, which is a little tricky. These are good questions. I thank you very much for the reason, for pointing out that D is a correct statement, but it's not an answer to the question. It's not why the depolarization is faster. Clear? Okay. What causes the plateau phase of contractile, atrial or ventricular myocytes? What is supporting the plateau, the sustained depolarization after the upstroke and before the repolarization? And I'll give you, so you're getting one of the 2 correct answers. You're all getting one of the 2 correct answers. Okay, so many of you are coming up with D and C. Why would resting potassium channels be open at the plateau? Does that make any sense? So now, given that hint, come up with another 2-way correct answer. Okay, now I'm seeing the answers. D and D. What's happening during the plateau? During the plateau, so in what state are voltage-gated sodium channels during the plateau? Inactivated. In what state are voltage-gated calcium channels? Open. Open and activated in calcium influx. Are the voltage-gated potassium channels open yet? Some are. So we have both calcium influx through voltage-gated calcium channels and potassium efflux through voltage-gated potassium channels. That balancing act is what sustains that depolarized plateau. What ends the plateau phase of cardiac contractile myocytes? Atrial and ventricular myocytes, and allows repolarization. What is the, so let's just be clear. What is the, I could have done this earlier in this discussion. So here is an action potential. We're talking, so here we're talking about, this is the plateau. We're talking about what's happening here. This is now where we are. What's causing this transition from plateau to repolarization? And I'm seeing a lot of correct answers. B and D. Okay, so that one you got right off the bat. Inactivation of voltage-gated calcium channels and activation of voltage-gated potassium channels is what allows this transition from plateau to repolarization. We can move right along because most of you got it right. That doesn't, and if you didn't, if you're confused, please talk to me in lab, talk to me after class, whatever, talk to me anytime. So here is the answer key. During the resting membrane potential, there is a lot of open resting potassium channels. The cell was stimulated by its neighbors to fire an action potential. It would have sat there at the resting membrane potential forever if it wasn't connected to some other cell that triggered it. It triggers, and we get sodium entry through voltage-gated sodium channels. Here, the sodium channels inactivate because they inactivate fast. The calcium channels activate because they activate slowly. So they're activating now sort of later in this depolarization. And potassium channels activate because they have about the same kinetics as calcium channels. So here we have calcium entry. This is what your book says, calcium entry, and this is my annotation. Calcium entry and potassium exit is what's going on here. Here we have calcium channels inactivate. The potassium channels are still activated. And so now the balance flow, now we have more potassium exit than calcium entry because the calcium channels have inactivated, and we repolarize. Your hearts repolarize. Questions? Again, understanding the state of the various channels in each phase of this action potential is something to know. That, and why do I want you to know it? Those are the molecular mechanisms, and that's going to be important knowledge for understanding the molecular mechanisms for why the heart beats stronger when you're stressed and why the heart beats weaker when you're sleeping, which we're getting to in a minute. So we have explained the pattern of depolarization, the pattern in the pacemaker cells. We've talked about atrial contraction. Well, I forget where the next clicker is going to. Okay. So we've talked about SA nodal depolarization and the mechanisms for that. We've talked about the mechanisms for depolarization, and you know that depolarization leads to contraction. So we're going to talk about the contraction. We're talking about the contraction of the atria, both on the right and the left side. And now we're going to talk about how that spreads into the ventricles. What causes the delay between atrial systole and ventricular systole? this is a trick question. I wrote this early this morning. I'm not sure I was fully awake. There's one best answer here. What causes the delay? Okay, so this one's tricky. The answer is B. The AV node has a slow depolarization, has a slow action potential, and it has slow conduction through it. Fewer gap junctions. So trick question, there is no delay. None of you chose that, thankfully. B is correct. So I can see why, I saw a lot of C's. The pacemaker depolarization of ventricles in the AV node is slower, but that doesn't explain the delay. So C is a true statement, but it doesn't explain the delay, because the ventricles, this C suggests that the ventricles have their own pacemaker, and they don't. They rely on the atrial pacemaker in the SA node, and then slow conduction through the AV node. So C wasn't worded very well, so if you chose B and C, I get it. I would be better about this on an exam and a quiz, and I wouldn't be writing them at 6 o'clock in the morning. And D is just wrong. Okay? Questions about this? So this one was confusing. Now is a good opportunity to help us all understand. Josh?
I'm trying to remember what exactly the Purkinje fibers do, because I thought I remember them having something to deal with this in electro.
So the Purkinje fibers are the fibers that propagate action potentials rapidly throughout the ventricles. And they really aren't connected to the AV node, at least not directly. And I mean, the ventricles have Purkinje fibers. That's a true statement. That slow ventricular depolarization is a false statement. They speed up ventricular depolarization. But that's what makes D wrong. C we've talked about because, and that one was a little ambiguous. A is clearly wrong. Okay, are we good here? Okay, what is the mechanism? So now, actually, this question gave you the answer to the previous one. What is the mechanism for slow action potential propagation through the AV node compared to atrial and ventricular myocardium? So basically, we're talking about what is the mechanism for slow conduction through the AV node compared to fast conduction, throughout the atria and fast conduction throughout the ventricles? Two good answers. Most of your data, A and B. Why is, so voltage-gated calcium channels are slow. We've talked about that. They have fewer gap junctions, so the slow depolarization by the slow calcium channels explains why each cell depolarizes slowly. And fewer gap junctions explains why the cell-to-cell-to-cell-to-cell depolarization is slow, which is part of the slow conduction through the AV node. Yeah.
Okay, so just so that I understand, both of the nodes, the SA node, the AV node, and the bundle of nodes, those are not neuronal.
They're not neuronal, they're muscle. Their job is not to contract the way most muscle is, but they are muscle cells, they are not nerve cells. Yes?
Can you explain why C is wrong, or?
The atria are insulated from the ventricles by a fibrous ring, but the AV node is not. Yes?
Can you show the gap junction in ventricular and
the gap junctions in the ventricles. So, question B.
Yeah, so the question they talked about is like gap junction and the cardiovascular, but I'm not seeing it in the background. So they talked about
Oh.
gap junction.
So so what's the image in my mind? I'm thinking about a ventricular myocardial cell, and here is its neighbor. So here is a stack of these, they're not bricks, they're cells, but they're sort of brick shaped. And the cells have a lot of gap junctions that connect them to their neighbors. So if this one fires an action potential, then the neighbors fire an action potential. The neighbors fire an action potential very quickly because this depolarization spreads. So it spreads from here to here, right? Through the gap junctions. The AV node, it's the same story, but there are fewer gap junction channels. So the spread from cell to cell to cell is slower. Okay, so we've talked about the delay, slow depolarization of the action potential, and slow cell-to-cell spread. Okay, so now we've spread into the ventricles. Let's see, are there more clickers coming up? Not really. Have we done them all? Okay. So ventricular myocytes have this is just a copy of the one that we showed before, because the ventricular myocytes have the same action potential as atrial myocytes. So I didn't print it out again. I didn't want to go onto a fifth page. So the ventricular myocytes have an action potential that is just like the atrial myocytes, and it follows the depolarization that spreads from the AV node, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, then ventricular myocytes. All of them have action potentials that look like this. They're fast depolarizing, and they're fast cell-to-cell-to-cell spreading. So let's take a break, and then we'll talk about control. How those channels are controlled to control the heart rate and heart strength. One is, remember, there's a biology colloquium at noon today, so you're invited to come have pizza and hear about Dan Atwater's research on plants. Announcement number 2 is your quiz is available at the CST desk. You pick it up, you put all your stuff away, then you pick it up, you sit down, you take it, and then you turn it in, and then you collect all your stuff. Don't use your stuff while you're taking the quiz. Don't be tempted, please. The quiz covers anatomy that we've used in class and in lab and in the coloring book. It uses physiology that we've covered in class and in your reading up to this point. So what we're doing, it does not cover the mechanisms of heart rate or heart strength modulation, and it doesn't cover the electrocardiogram. Okay? But everything up to this point is fair game. So the material we covered, in the first class about transporters, and the material we covered in the second class about muscle contraction mechanisms, and the material we talked about now about the pattern of electrical activity in the heart, and the mechanisms for the flow of that information from AV node, from SA node to atria to AV node to that is all fair game. I'm happy to answer questions about the quiz up until the point when you're actually taking the quiz. But since most of you are taking it Sunday and I'm not available on Sunday, I won't. If you try to email me while you're taking the quiz, you've actually broken the rules because you're not supposed to have the computer out, right? So don't do that. Did you have a question, Larry?
No.
Okay. So you check out, it's due Sunday night. It'll take you about a half an hour. A well-prepared student will be able to do it in, let's just say 45 minutes. I'm happy to answer questions. Do I need to know this? I'm happy to answer those questions. You just have to email me the questions. Your concepts list includes the physiology that you need to know. Up to this point, you'll see where the break is between what we're doing now and what we've done before. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the mechanisms for heart rate and strength, but mostly rate control. So this is a plot that is a cartoon representation of the pattern of excitation of action potentials in a pacemaker cell. There is no resting membrane potential because it goes negative, but then it spontaneously depolarizes by the mechanisms that you are understanding. Oh, by the way, let me just give you, if you feel discouraged by the fact that you didn't get the clickers all right, please don't be. I have taught this stuff for many years, and the first 2/3 of my career, I taught this stuff, these very same concepts to medical students. And they struggle with it just as much as you do. So and if you go to medical school, you'll have a head start on this because you will not struggle with it as much. Even if you've forgotten some of it, it'll come back faster. So I understand that it's hard, that people that get 40s on the MCAT struggle with this material. So I do understand that this is hard, but you can do it. That's the best I can do for a couple.
That's not
It's
right.
good. Caught me up.
40's like really low now.
It is?
Yeah, because like now the numbers are like really high. You said 40, I was like, wait a second.
Oh, it used to be that 40 was perfect.
Yeah, no
So
longer.
they changed
Now it's
that.
like 520 is good.
Oh, okay, they changed.
That's a long shot.
Okay, sorry, I'm not. When I taught medical students were getting 30s. 35 was a good score on the MCAT when I taught medical students.
I think 510 now.
Okay, so they changed it completely. Okay, so here's the pacemaker. Here's the pacemaker potential, and then it reaches threshold, and it fires an action potential. So how can we change the rate of the heart? Well, we change the rate. There's 3 ways. We're going to see 3 slides. We can see the rate of the pacemaker depolarization increasing, right? If we increase the slope of this line from here to here, you should be able to see that that's steeper, then it's reaching threshold faster, so the interval between beats is less, and if the interval between beats is less, the rate goes up. It's not a rate, it's a frequency, but we talk about the heart. We don't talk about heart frequency, we talk about heart rate. Clear? If all we do is change the rate of the ultra slow depolarization, we would increase the heart rate. And so there are 3 mechanisms for increasing or decreasing. We have 3 channels, and they can all be modulated. If we increase the activity of IH, more sodium influx, faster depolarization, gets to threshold faster. If we increase the rate of K channel, potassium channel closing, faster closing allows the IH and the calcium channels to have more of an effect quicker. Faster closing, faster depolarization. Sooner reaching a threshold, faster rate. Increased calcium channels activity, same as IH. More influx of calcium, faster depolarization, reaches threshold faster. This is pretty intuitive. All 3 of these mechanisms happen in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll see in a minute. And if I want to decrease, if I want to slow the rate, I just reverse what I just talked about. So that's why we can increase the activity or decrease the activity to cause increases or decreases in pacemaking rate. Questions? That's mechanism 1. That's pretty easy. Well, it's mechanism 1, A, B, and C.
So we just have to know that these are the ways to increase or decrease the rate, not like the mechanism of how each of those happen, right?
Not yet, you'll know that in a few seconds. Another way, so this is mechanism 2, another way is that if we make the maximum, if we make the most negative point that it gets to, which is called the maximum diastolic polarization, MDP, maximum diastolic polarization. Remember, it's never at rest, but it does have a maximum. It's most negative at a certain point. That's its maximum. So you would say, why do you call the most negative the minimum? Well, I mean, why don't you call the most negative the minimum? I don't know, we call it the maximum. Most hyperpolarized. If we make the maximum polarization less negative, and we change nothing else, we're closer to threshold from the start, and we get to threshold faster. How can we change the maximum polarization? Decreasing potassium channels, decreasing potassium channels would make the MDP less negative. Increasing the activity of potassium channels would make MDP more negative and would slow the heart rate. Is that clear? So we have now in this scenario, mechanisms 2A and B are changing MDP. In reality, when we talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, all of the mechanism 1 and 2 are going to happen at the same time. But I'm breaking it up into try to make it clearer. Because in 1, we're talking about the rate. We're starting at the same point and we're increasing the slope. And in 2, we're not changing the slope, but we're changing the starting point. In reality, they both change. And now in 3, which also changes, if we change threshold, we're not changing MDP, we're not changing the rate of slow depolarization, but if we make threshold more negative, it'll get to threshold faster, and the frequency will go up. Less time between beats, faster frequency, higher rate. Threshold in pacemaker cells is set by the transition from a few calcium channels open to many calcium channels open. So if we change the activation properties of calcium channels, if we make channels open at more negative voltages, we will fire an action potential sooner. And if we make the calcium channels open at less negative or more depolarized voltages, we will make the threshold will go up. That would cause a delay, and that would slow the heart rate. Kendra.
Okay, so the first mechanism brings them closer together.
Okay, the first mechanism, all 3 of these bring them closer together. This is illustrating increasing the heart rate. This is illustrating what happens when you go out for a run. All 3 of them. This one is increasing the rate because the slow depolarization is faster. This one is increasing the rate because we start from a less negative starting point. And this one is increasing the rate because we make the threshold less. We're making the threshold more negative. All 3 of these illustrations are illustrating increasing the heart rate, but all we have to do is cartoon the reds to see the slowing of the heart rate. Is that clear? I know I printed in black and white, so lower and raise don't have the color coding that you might like, but you can highlight them differently or something in order to see, because the slides are, the illustration is increasing the heart rate only, but the words are trying to explain how you could both increase the heart rate or decrease the heart rate. Is that clear? So those are the three general mechanisms. Now let's get to Brittany's question. Do we have to know how we do these things? And the answer is yes, but it's not so hard. So here is a cartoon of a heart rate increasing. Right, here's the pace, you know, beat, beat. I'm just sort of walking along here, beat, 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 beat. You know, it's fast. I exaggerated. How does that happen? The sympathetic nervous system is the key to how this happens. So now I'm coming back to your very first, maybe second class in this course, and back to self-is. GS-coupled receptors, adenylyl cyclase. So the sympathetic nervous system activates GS-coupled receptors. Adenylyl cyclase, this should all be a ringing of the bell so far. Adenylyl cyclase, cyclic AMP, PKA. PKA activates IH and calcium channels. So what does activating IH do? In more sodium influx during the ultra-slow pacemaker potential. That speeds the heart rate. What does increasing calcium channel activity do? More depolarization during the pacemaker cell. And what does it do? What would activate making calcium channels easier to open due to threshold? We don't have to worry about calcium-induced calcium release because we're talking about electrical, not contractile activity. What would turning on voltage-gated calcium channels do to threshold?
Lower it down.
It would make it lower. So the slope is getting faster and it's going to a lower threshold. So both of those things are in play to make, during the sympathetic nervous system, activation of pacemaker cells that make your heart beat faster when you're stressed, physical or mental stress. Okay, so what goes up must come down, or hopefully comes down. You don't want to stay stressed forever. So the parasympathetic nervous system slows your heart rate. So when you're relaxed, when you're resting, when you're digesting, your heart rate slows. GI-coupled receptors. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the names of the receptors, but I do want you to know that GI-coupled receptors, remember GI, it inhibits adenylyl cyclase, it lowers the production of cyclic AMP because the phosphodiesterase is cutting it up all the time. It lowers the activation of PKA. So less PKA, less IH. Is that clear why that slows the heart? Less sodium influx through IH slows the pacemaker potential. Less calcium channel activity, less calcium influx, slower pacemaker activity, and a raising of threshold. And now one more trick. This thing also increases the activity of potassium channels. So the increasing activity of potassium channels makes, well, that will slow the slow depolarization. And it will make the maximum diastolic polarization more negative. So this does all three of those mechanisms. Slower pacemaking potential, and a raised threshold, a more negative, maximum negative potential, maximum polarization, a more negative hyperpolarization. All three of those things do the slowing of the heart rate during the parasympathetic nervous system. And you're going to see this in lab today. So you're going to have a frog heart, it's going to be sitting there beating, you're going to manipulate it with epinephrine, which is, we can't activate the sympathetic nervous system. I don't have the tools for that. So we're going to simulate the sympathetic nervous system by applying adrenaline to the heart. And we will hopefully see the heart rate increase and the strength increase. will mimic this parasympathetic nervous system by applying acetylcholine, the agonist of muscarinic receptors. And that will be simulation. We can't activate the parasympathetic nervous system, but we can simulate it with acetylcholine. So that's what you're going to see in lab today, and hopefully the frogs that we get will cooperate. Their hearts will show us what we expect to see. Is it clear from here why the sympathetic nervous system causes the strength of the heart to increase? This slide is showing why the rate increases, but the strength of the heartbeat also increases. If I wanted you to circle something that indicated why the strength increases, what would you circle? What triggers contraction in ventricular myocardium? Calcium channels. So an increase in calcium channel activity is going to lead to more calcium influx, more calcium release through calcium-induced calcium release, more binding to troponin. Now we're in the problem set. More binding to troponin, more cross-bridge cycling, more strength. So sympathetic nervous system increases the rate and the strength of the heart. Parasympathetic nervous system slows the rate and decreases the strength of the heart. Okay, so now in the last 8 minutes of class, so I probably am not going to get through all of this, but I want to introduce the electrocardiogram. So this basically the spread of electrical activity from SA node through atria to AV node through the bundle of His, the bundle of branches, the Purkinje fibers, ventricular myocardium, SA node, atrial myocardium, AV node, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, ventricular myocardium. This spread of action potentials generates the electrocardiogram that we record from electrodes that you put on your skin. So that's sort of amazing. This is what it looks like in the hospital, but we're not going to see that. So let's just jump to this one. I need to start using some language. This is the language, the universal language of the electrocardiogram. So if you go to France and you start doing some cardiology in France, they will talk about the same waveform with the same letters as we do here. So there is this small blip called the P wave. There's this big blip that we call the QRS complex. And there's this smaller blip that we call the T wave. That's the language you need to know. You don't need to know the scale. So now we're going to try to understand these signals. The electrocardiogram that you're going to, the electrocardiogram is recorded from multiple electrodes. So how many of you have ever had an ECG recording done on you? Okay, they probably stuck some sort of, they attached with an adhesive electrodes to your body, right? And they may have attached as many as 12 electrodes to your body. We're only going to do 3 at a time. And we're going to talk about the connections between those electrodes. So we talk about the so-called leads, not lead, lead 1, 2, and 3. Lead 1, 2, and 3. So lead 1 is defined by electrodes on the right arm and the left arm. Lead 2 is defined by electrodes connected to the right arm and the left leg. And lead 3 is defined by a connection between the left arm and the left leg. You don't need to know the connections. What I am going to ask you to memorize is the compass. What do I mean by compass? Lead 1, lead 2, lead 3. This is the orientation of the leads on the chest of the person you're measuring. So lead 1 defines a vector this way. lead 2 defines a vector angled down this way, from upper right to lower left. So this is left, and this is right. And this is superior, and this is inferior. That's a compass, a vertical compass on the surface of the body. And these are the orientations of those connections. We also define 3 more. We talk about the AVF, AVR, and AVL. We will not be measuring those in lab. The ones we will be measuring in lab are probably only lead 1, 2, and or 3. Those are the ones we're going to be using in lab today. But in the clinic, they define these 6 the 6 leads, called the 6 limb leads because they're connected to arms and legs. There are also so let's forget there's 6 more that I'm going to skip. Okay, we can come back to that later. So these leads define orientations in the body. And you know that when electrical activity spreads, so this cartoon is supposed to illustrate a snapshot in time when the SA node has depolarized and the rest of the heart has not depolarized. So the SA node is at a depolarized voltage, and the rest of the heart is at a resting membrane potential. We're pretty close to it. And that separation of charge defines a vector. And that vector, so this is getting into physics. Many of you have had physics, but this is pretty straightforward physics. If the vector of the depolarization is aligned with the axis, you get a big positive signal. If the vector is perpendicular to the electrode that's measuring it, the electrode is blind to it. It can't see anything in that orientation. And if the vector is, oblique to the lead, then you get a smaller signal. So the amplitude of the signal is determined both by the size of the vector and by its orientation with each of those electrical wires. If the vector is anti-parallel with the lead, you get a negative signal. If there is no vector, you get no signal. But the point is here, there's 2 ways to see no signal. There could be a perfectly strong signal, but it's perpendicular to the thing you're looking at it with. Or there could be no signal. So I'll probably throw a curveball at you on that one in a quiz set. It's not on this quiz. Remember, this material is not on the quiz. So let me rush through the next few slides. And because all I want to do is introduce the ECG. The P wave represents the spread of depolarization throughout the atria. So the atrial depolarization, it shows up as the P wave. The QRS, I'm going to skip through to the next one. The QRS complex represents the spread of depolarization throughout the ventricles. And I'll break that down next week after you've had a chance to see it in lab. And the T wave represents the spread of repolarization. So this is atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and ventricular repolarization. I think that's all you need to know to make sense out of the lab today. So let's quit, have a good lunch. This lab is going to run until 3:30 or 9:30. So if those